The city had learned to breathe around fear. Not openly, not in ways that could be named or traced, but in the quiet adjustments people made without thinking, the routes they avoided after sunset, the conversations they lowered their voices for, the deals that were made behind doors no one acknowledged existed. Power had long stopped announcing itself here. It operated in silence, in pressure, in outcomes that appeared inevitable long before anyone understood why. At the center of that silent control stood Adrian Vale. He did not rise to power through spectacle. There were no dramatic takeovers, no public declarations of dominance. His ascent had been quieter than that, methodical, deliberate, precise. He built his empire the way a strategist builds a system, not by reacting to threats, but by anticipating them before they fully formed. And for years, it had worked. The Vale organization was not just strong, it was stable. Its operations ran with a level of discipline that most rival groups could not replicate. Territories remained secure. Alliances held. Conflicts ended before they escalated into chaos. Until they didn't. The first sign of change had not been obvious. It never was. A shipment delayed. A contact that stopped responding. A deal that failed without explanation. Individually, they were insignificant. Together, they formed a pattern. And Adrian Vale did not ignore patterns. By the time others began to notice something was wrong, he had already begun adjusting. Routes were shifted. Internal structures tightened. Communications restricted. He moved with the same calculated precision that had always defined him. But this time, something was different, because the opposition was not reacting to him. It was moving ahead of him. That was the intellectual hook. Because the most dangerous enemy is not the one you can see. It is the one already thinking ahead of you. Roman Cade had never been underestimated, but he had never been this controlled. His expansion had not followed the usual trajectory of aggressive power grabs. There were no reckless moves, no unnecessary risks. Instead, his influence spread quietly, filling spaces Adrian's system had not yet reinforced. It was not chaos. It was design. And design meant intention. Adrian stood at the far end of the conference room, his gaze fixed on the city beyond the glass walls. From this height, everything looked orderly, predictable, under control, but he knew better. Control was not defined by what could be seen. It was defined by what could not. Behind him, the room remained silent. No one spoke unless necessary. No one interrupted his focus. The men gathered there understood something fundamental about their leader. He did not need noise to command attention. His presence did that on its own. The northern routes. One of them said finally, his voice measured but tight. We've lost access to 2 of them. Adrian did not turn. Not lost, he replied calmly. Redirected. The correction was immediate, precise, because loss implied failure. And failure was rarely accidental. The man hesitated slightly before continuing. Then he's moving faster than expected. Adrian's gaze remained steady, his posture unchanged. He's not moving faster, he said. He's moving earlier. That distinction settled heavily in the room, because it meant one thing. Roman Cade was not reacting to war. He had already prepared for it. The silence that followed was not uncertainty. It was realization. And realization always comes too late. Adrian turned then, his expression composed, his focus sharp. Everything he's doing points to one outcome, he said. No one asked what that outcome was. They already knew. Consolidation, control, elimination. The war had not been declared, but it had already begun. And Adrian Vale was not in the position he preferred to be. He was responding. That was the emotional hook. Because power begins to weaken the moment it stops leading and starts reacting. The decision was made before it was spoken, because men like Adrian did not arrive at decisions through debate. They arrived through necessity. Prepare the arrangement, he said. The words were simple, but their meaning was not. No one questioned it, because everyone in that room understood what it meant. This was not strategy in the traditional sense. This was leverage, and leverage required sacrifice. Across the city, far removed from the controlled tension of Adrian's world, Ilara Quinn stood in a space that had always been defined by order. But today, that order felt different. The Quinn estate did not display power the way the Vale organization did. It was older, more restrained. Its influence built over generations rather than enforced through dominance. It was a place where control had always existed quietly, and Alara had learned to live within that quiet. She stood near the window, her posture composed, her gaze steady as it rested on the grounds beyond. Everything outside remained unchanged. The same structured gardens, the same measured symmetry, the same illusion of permanence. But illusions were fragile, and she had always understood that. Alara Quinn was not someone who reacted easily. She did not express more than necessary. She did not allow emotion to guide her decisions, because she had learned early that control was not something given. It was something maintained. Footsteps approached behind her, measured but deliberate. She did not turn immediately, because she already knew her father did not waste movement, and when he approached her directly, it meant something had already been decided. "You've been informed," he said. Not a question, a confirmation. Alara turned slowly, her expression neutral, her posture unchanged. "Yes." Her response was quiet, but complete. There was no hesitation in it, because hesitation would not change what came next. Her father studied her for a moment, as if measuring something beyond her words. "This is necessary," he said. Again, not a discussion, a structure. Alara's gaze held his. "Necessary for who?" she asked. The question was calm, but it carried weight, because necessity is never neutral. Her father did not answer immediately, because answers create accountability. "For the family," he said finally, the expected response, the practice one. But Alara did not respond, because she understood something he had chosen not to say. This was not about preservation. It was about positioning. That was the intellectual hook, because when people say something is necessary, they are often protecting something they are not willing to lose. "Alara," he continued, his tone tightening slightly, "this is not a choice." The words settled between them, clear, defined, final, but something about them did not shift her, because Alara Quinn had never believed in the illusion of choice, only in outcomes, and outcomes were already in motion. She inclined her head slightly, not in agreement, in acknowledgement, because resisting now would serve no purpose. The marriage was not arranged to benefit her. It was arranged to stabilize something larger, and she was part of that structure, not its center, its solution. That was the emotional hook, because sometimes people are not asked to make decisions, they are placed inside them. The ceremony was scheduled quickly, not rushed, but efficient, because urgency does not allow delay. The venue reflected the nature of the arrangement, controlled, private, structured to ensure completion, not celebration. Alara stood at the entrance, her posture straight, her expression unchanged. Her attire reflected elegance without excess, every detail measured, every element intentional. She did not look like someone being forced, and that was what made her difficult to read, because fear was absent, not because it did not exist, but because she did not allow it to define her. At the end of the aisle stood Adrian Vale, unmoving, uncompromised. He did not observe her with curiosity. He did not assess her in the moment, because that had already been done. This was execution, not introduction. The space between them carried no emotion, only alignment. Two individuals positioned inside a structure neither had created, but both understood. The ceremony began. Words were spoken, vows repeated, not as promises, as requirements, because this was not about union. It was about outcome. Adrian's voice remained steady, controlled, unaffected. Alara's voice followed, equally precise, equally detached. The rings were exchanged, not as symbols of connection, but as markers of position. And when it was done, nothing changed, not visibly, because nothing had been built, only established. That was the intellectual hook, because some marriages do not create something new. They confirm something that was already decided. They stood side by side for a brief moment, not connected, not distant, aligned, and in that alignment, the structure was complete. The observers did not react, because there was nothing to celebrate, only something to acknowledge. Adrian turned slightly, his movement controlled, signaling the next phase without words. Elara followed, not because she was guided, but because she understood. The transition from ceremony to aftermath was immediate. No pause, no separation, because this was not an event. It was a step, and steps lead forward. The night settled quietly around them, but the tension remained, not external, internal, because now everything had changed, not in appearance. In reality, Elara entered the space prepared for her without hesitation. Her movements remained composed, her awareness sharp. This was not unfamiliar territory, not entirely, because she understood systems. And this was a system, controlled, layered, deliberate. Adrian did not follow immediately, because proximity was not required. Control did not depend on presence. It depended on structure. Elara moved further into the room, her gaze taking in details without appearing to do so. Positioning, entrances, distance. Nothing was accidental. Everything served a purpose. And that told her everything she needed to know. She did not sit. She did not wait. She observed. Because observation reveals truth. The door opened quietly behind her. Adrian entered, not rushed, not delayed. His presence shifted the space without effort. But Elara did not turn immediately, because reacting was not necessary. Not yet. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, measured, and then she spoke, not as someone uncertain, not as someone afraid, but as someone who had already understood something fundamental. He hadn't married her for alliance, not completely. He hadn't married her for power, not entirely. There was something else, something unspoken, something beneath the structure. And as that realization settled into place, aligning every detail she had observed with every decision that had led to this moment, one truth became impossible to ignore. She was not the only one being positioned. And as the silence between them deepened, carrying the weight of everything that had not been said, one undeniable realization surfaced quietly, but with sharp clarity. But on the wedding night, she didn't behave like someone who was powerless. The transition from ceremony to reality did not happen with noise. It happened with silence. The moment Elara Quinn crossed the threshold into Adrian Vale's estate, the world she had just left behind ceased to matter in any practical sense. There were no lingering traces of the wedding, no emotional residue, no pause to acknowledge what had been done. The structure she had entered did not allow for that kind of reflection. It moved forward, constantly, and now she was inside it. The estate did not resemble the kind of space designed for comfort. It was not cold, but it was not warm either. Everything about it existed with purpose. Clean architectural lines, open spaces that were not meant for display, but for visibility. Even the lighting felt calculated, bright enough to remove shadows, controlled enough to guide attention. It was not a home. It was a system. Elara noticed that immediately, not because it was obvious, but because it was consistent. Consistency in environments like this revealed control, and control was something she understood. She did not hesitate as she moved further inside. Her steps were steady, her posture composed, her expression neutral. There was no visible adjustment in her behavior, no sign that she was processing a change, because she already had. The moment she accepted the marriage, she had accepted the environment that came with it. That was the intellectual hook. Because the strongest people are not the ones who react to change. They're the ones who prepare for it before it happens. Staff members moved through the space with quiet efficiency. Their presence was subtle, but not invisible. They acknowledged her position without direct engagement, their behavior reflecting training rather than curiosity. No one stared. No one questioned. No one hesitated. Because in this environment, roles were understood instantly, and hers had already been defined. Adrian Vale's wife, a title that carried weight, but also expectation. Elara moved toward the central corridor, her gaze lifting slightly as she took in the layout without appearing to do so. The spacing between rooms, the positioning of entry points, the lines of sight that extended further than they should have. Nothing here was accidental. Every detail served a function. She paused briefly near a wide glass panel overlooking the interior courtyard. The open space below was empty, but not unmonitored. She could feel it, not directly, not in a way that could be proven, but in the subtle alignment of the structure. Observation points existed. Hidden, integrated, strategic. Her eyes shifted slightly, tracing the edges of the architecture, the angles that allowed visibility without exposure. And in that moment, something settled. This place was not built for living. It was built for control. That was the emotional hook. Because the difference between a home and a system is that one protects you and the other watches you. Behind her, movement continued. A staff member adjusted something near the corridor entrance. Another passed through a side passage without drawing attention. Normal behavior, expected behavior. But Alara did not observe it the way most would. She observed patterns, and patterns revealed structure. She resumed walking, her pace unchanged, her presence blending into the environment without diminishing, because blending in was not the same as being unnoticed. It was the ability to exist without drawing reaction, and she did it effortlessly. Adrian Vale noticed. He had been observing from a distance, not physically present in the same immediate space, but aware of her movement through the internal surveillance network that monitored every corridor, every transition, every point of entry. He did not need to follow her. The system did that for him. At first, there was nothing unusual. Her posture was controlled, her movements measured, her behavior aligned with someone maintaining composure under pressure. That was expected. But then, something shifted, not in what she did, in how she did it. Adrian leaned slightly against the edge of the control desk, his gaze fixed on a live feed as Alara paused near the courtyard glass. She wasn't looking at the view. She was studying the structure, the angle of her head, the stillness of her posture, the way her gaze moved, not across the space, but through it. That was not passive observation. That was analysis. And analysis was not expected, especially not from someone in her position. That was the intellectual hook. Because when someone begins to understand your system without being shown, it means they've seen systems like it before. Adrian remained still, his expression unchanged, but his attention sharpened. He had seen fear before. He had seen resistance. He had seen forced compliance disguised as composure. But this was different. Alara Quinn was not reacting to the environment. She was reading it. The distinction mattered, because reacting meant uncertainty. Reading meant awareness. And awareness created risk. He shifted his focus slightly, adjusting the camera angle to capture her movement as she stepped away from the glass and continued down the corridor. Her pace remained steady. No hesitation. No missteps. She did not pause unnecessarily. She did not seek direction. She moved as if she understood where she was going, even though she had never been there before. Adrian's gaze narrowed slightly, because that did not align. Alara entered a secondary hall, her attention moving subtly across the structure without drawing attention to itself. A staircase to the left, 2 access points to the right, a narrow passage further ahead. Security placements were not obvious, but they were there. She could feel them. The slight shift in air when someone adjusted position behind a wall. The near-silent footstep that came too precisely timed to be accidental. This environment was alive, not visibly, but functionally, and she was already mapping it. She slowed slightly as she approached a turn in the corridor, not enough to appear hesitant, but enough to confirm something internally. There, a blind spot, not complete, but partial, a space where visibility dropped for less than a second before realignment. Her gaze did not linger. Her expression did not change, but she had seen it, and that was enough. Behind the screens, Adrian saw it too, not the blind spot, her reaction to it, or rather, the absence of reaction. She did not adjust her movement. She did not hesitate. She did not reveal that she had noticed anything at all, and that confirmed everything, because people who discover something unexpected react. They pause. They question. They adjust. Alara did none of those things, which meant It wasn't unexpected. That was the emotional hook. Because when someone does not react to something they should have noticed, it means they were already expecting it. Adrian straightened slightly, his attention no longer casual. This was no longer observation. This was evaluation. He stepped away from the monitoring station, moving toward the main corridor with controlled precision. Not rushed, not reactive, but intentional. Because now, distance was no longer useful. He needed to see her directly. Illyra continued forward, her awareness expanded with each step, but her behavior remaining unchanged. She did not look behind her. She did not check her surroundings, because she already understood something critical. In a place like this, you're always being watched. Looking for it only confirms it, so she didn't. She allowed the system to believe she was exactly what expected, controlled, compliant, unaware, but internally, she was anything but. She reached the end of the corridor, just as Adrian entered from the opposite direction. Their movement aligned, not by chance, but by design. They stopped a few steps apart. No urgency, no tension, just presence. Adrian studied her directly now, without the distance of screens or the filter of surveillance. And what he saw confirmed his suspicion. Her posture was composed, but not defensive. Her expression was neutral, but not uncertain. Her gaze met his, not challengingly, not submissively, but steadily, as if she understood exactly where she stood, and more importantly, as if she was not intimidated by it. That was the emotional hook, because fear was expected, but she showed control. The silence between them stretched briefly, not uncomfortable, but measured. Adrian did not speak immediately, because speaking too soon reveals intent, and he was not ready to reveal anything yet. Instead, he observed the subtle tension in her shoulders, present but controlled, the stillness in her posture, not rigid but balanced, the way her gaze held his, not searching, not avoiding. Nothing about her aligned with what he had expected from this arrangement. Nothing. And that made her unpredictable. Unpredictable meant dangerous, not in the conventional sense, but in the way that disrupted systems. And systems did not tolerate disruption. Illyra held his gaze for a moment longer before shifting slightly, not breaking eye contact abruptly, but ending it with intention, not avoidance. Decision. She turned just enough to reposition herself within the space, maintaining awareness without creating confrontation, because confrontation would expose too much, and exposure was not her goal. Not yet. Adrian noticed that too. The controlled disengagement, the absence of emotional response, the deliberate nature of her movement. This was not instinct. This was discipline. And discipline was learned, which meant it came from somewhere. That thought settled into place with quiet precision, because now the question was no longer whether something was wrong. The question was what exactly she was hiding. He stepped slightly closer, closing part of the distance without fully removing it, because proximity creates pressure, and pressure reveals truth. But Illyra did not react to the shift. Her posture remained unchanged, her awareness constant, her control intact, and that confirmed it. She was not adjusting to his world. She was navigating it. The distinction was critical, because adjustment implied learning. Navigation implied experience. Adrian's final realization settled with quiet certainty, aligning every observation, every inconsistency, every moment that had not fit into a clear pattern. This was not a woman placed into a system she did not understand. This was someone who recognized it, understood it, and knew how to exist inside it without being consumed by it. And as that understanding took full shape, removing the last layer of assumption and replacing it with something far more precise, one undeniable truth emerged. Adrian realized she might not be who she claims to be. Adrian Vale did not believe in coincidence, not in business, not in power, and certainly not in war. Every shift, every loss, every disruption in his system had a cause. That belief had shaped the way he built his empire, structured, calculated, designed to eliminate uncertainty before it could become a threat. But now, Uncertainty was no longer external. It was inside his system. The realization followed him long after his encounter with Alara in the corridor. Her composure had not faded from his thoughts. It did not sit as curiosity. It existed as a variable, one that did not yet have a defined place within his structure. And undefined variables were dangerous. But even that was not the most pressing issue, because beyond the walls of his estate, something far more immediate was unfolding. Roman Cade was advancing, not aggressively, not visibly, but effectively. The updates came in quietly, one after another, each carrying the same underlying pattern: territory influence shifting, contacts becoming unreachable, supply chains rerouted without warning, agreements dissolving without explanation. Individually, none of it suggested collapse. But together, they formed something else: control. That was the intellectual hook. Because wars are not lost when you see defeat. They are lost when someone else starts controlling the outcome. Adrian stood once again in the strategy room, though the space felt different now. Not physically, but in function. The same screens displayed data. The same structure remained intact. But the information flowing through it carried a different weight. Not prediction. Confirmation. One of his senior operatives stepped forward, placing a report on the table with measured restraint. "We confirmed it," he said. "Cade has secured the eastern corridor." Adrian did not react immediately, because reaction would not change the outcome. "That route wasn't exposed," another added, tension barely contained beneath his voice. "It was reinforced last quarter." Adrian's gaze moved across the screen, analyzing the data without interruption. "Reinforcement doesn't matter," he said calmly, "if the point of access was already known." The room fell silent, because that statement implied something deeper, something internal. Information did not leak on its own. It was moved, which meant someone inside his system was no longer aligned. That was the emotional hook, because betrayal is not loud. It is quiet, precise, and always too late to stop. Adrian leaned slightly against the edge of the table, his mind moving ahead of the information presented to him. Roman Cade was not just expanding. He was targeting. Every move aligned with something specific. Every shift in power corresponded with a weakness that should not have been visible from the outside. That was not coincidence. That was access. And access came from within. The realization did not unsettle him. It clarified the situation, because now he knew what he was dealing with, not just an external enemy, an internal fracture. His gaze shifted briefly toward the far end of the room, where a separate screen displayed movement logs within the estate. Alara Quinn appeared there again, walking through another section of the building, her posture composed, her behavior unchanged. For a moment, the two realities overlapped: the external war and the internal variable, because something about her still did not align. But Adrian pushed that thought aside. For now, because the war required immediate attention. "Reassign the northern defense," he said. "Shifted to compensate for the eastern loss." One of the men hesitated. "That leaves the central route exposed." Adrian's expression remained unchanged. "It's already exposed," he replied. The statement landed with quiet finality, because it confirmed something none of them had wanted to say. They were not preventing losses anymore. They were managing them. That was the intellectual hook, because the moment you stop controlling a war and start adjusting to it, you're already behind. Across the city, Roman Cade stood in a space that mirrored Adrian's in function, but not in philosophy. Where Adrian's world operated on precision and restraint, Roman's operated on inevitability. He did not rush decisions. He did not waste movement. But unlike Adrian, he embraced momentum. And right now, momentum was on his side. A map stretched across the central table before him, marked not with chaos, but with clarity. Every shift in territory had been planned. Every disruption in Adrian's system had been anticipated, because Roman had not entered the war recently. He had entered it long before Adrian realized it had begun. "That's the third adjustment he's made this week," one of his men said. Roman's gaze remained steady. "He's reacting," he replied. No satisfaction, no arrogance, just acknowledgement. Because reaction was exactly where he wanted Adrian to be. He's not collapsing, the man added carefully. Roman nodded once. I don't need him to collapse. The statement was calm, but precise, because collapse was unpredictable. Control was not. I need him to move exactly where I expect him to. And so far, he was. That was the emotional hook, because the most dangerous victory is not the one you fight for, it's the one you've already designed. Back inside the Vale estate, the pressure continued to build. Every update reinforced the same pattern. Loss, adjustment, exposure. And yet, Adrian remained composed, not because the situation was stable, but because instability required clarity, and clarity required control. But something about this war was different. It was not chaotic. It was structured, and structured threats were harder to break. His attention returned briefly to Alara, not intentionally, but inevitably, because she had not asked questions. She had not reacted to the shift in atmosphere. She had not displayed any concern about the war unfolding around her. Instead, she continued to observe, to move, to exist within the system, as if she had already accounted for what was happening. That thought settled deeper than he expected, because it did not belong. Not yet, and yet it remained. He turned away from the screen, his focus returning to the immediate problem. Find the breach, he said. The instruction was simple, but the implication was not, because breaches like this were not singular. They were layered, and finding one did not mean finding all. Still, it was the only move left, because until the internal fracture was identified, nothing else could be stabilized. Time passed, not quickly, not slowly, but with increasing weight. Each hour carried confirmation of what Adrian had already understood. The marriage had not changed the trajectory. It had not slowed Roman's advance. It had not reinforced his position. If anything, it had come too late. That was the emotional hook, because he thought the marriage would save the war, but the war was already slipping away. The realization did not come as shock. It came as alignment. Everything that had seemed like pressure now made sense. The urgency, the timing, the lack of negotiation. This was not a solution. It was a delay. And delays only work when there was still something to save. His gaze returned to the data once more, analyzing patterns that no longer required interpretation. The war had already shifted, not in visible outcome, but in control. And control determined everything. Across the estate, Alara stood once again near a window, her posture unchanged, her awareness quiet but active. She had felt the shift before it became visible, not through information, but through behavior. The way movement had tightened, the way conversations had shortened, the way the environment had adjusted, subtly but consistently. Pressure had entered the system, and pressure always revealed truth. She did not need reports. She did not need confirmation, because she had already seen it. The war was not escalating. It was reaching its next phase. And that phase was not favorable to Adrian. Her gaze shifted slightly, not toward anything specific, but toward the structure as a whole, because she understood something critical. This was not a battle of strength. It was a battle of positioning. And right now, Adrian was being positioned. That was the intellectual hook, because losing a war is not about being weaker. It's about being placed where defeat becomes inevitable. She exhaled slowly, her expression unchanged, because this outcome was not unexpected, not to her, not entirely. Behind her, movement continued, but she did not turn, because she already knew something no one else in that estate had fully accepted yet. The war was not just being fought, it was being controlled, and not by Adrian. Her final realization settled quietly, aligning everything she had observed with everything that had unfolded since the moment she entered this world. Because this was not a war that could be won through reaction. It required something else. Something Adrian did not yet see, but she did, and as the weight of that understanding settled into place, connecting past knowledge with present reality, one final truth emerged. And somehow, Alara already knew what was coming. The pressure inside the Vale estate did not explode. It tightened, What had once been a controlled system now carried subtle fractures, small enough to ignore individually, but impossible to dismiss when seen together. Movements became more deliberate, conversations shorter, decisions sharper. Adrian Vale had already accepted one truth. The war was no longer balanced. But what he had not yet accepted was how predictable his position had become, because predictability, in a war built on control, was the first sign of exposure, and exposure invited defeat. He stood in the operations room again, reviewing a new set of movement reports, not because he expected different results, but because patterns often reveal themselves when examined from a different angle. And this time, something did, not in the data, in the timing. A shipment that should have been intercepted wasn't. A route that should have been targeted was bypassed. At first glance, it looked like inconsistency. But Adrian did not believe in inconsistency. He believed in intention, which meant someone had shifted something. That was the intellectual hook. Because when outcomes change without visible reason, it means someone is influencing the system from within. His gaze lifted slightly, not toward the screens, but toward a different thought. Elara Quinn, not because she had done anything obvious, but because she had done nothing at all. No questions, no concern, no visible reaction to the escalating pressure. And yet, something about the environment around her had begun to change. Subtly, but consistently. He stepped away from the table, his mind aligning with a realization he had not yet fully acknowledged, because this was no longer just about the war. This was about control, and control was shifting. Across the estate, Elara stood near one of the internal balconies, her posture composed, her gaze directed outward, not at the landscape, but through it. Her awareness had not relaxed since she arrived. It had sharpened, because the structure around her had revealed enough for her to understand its function. And once something is understood, it can be anticipated. She did not need reports. She did not need confirmation, because she had already seen the pattern. The war was not random. It was structured, and structured conflict followed logic. Her gaze shifted slightly as movement below caught her attention. A guard repositioned, not dramatically, but enough to signal adjustment. Timing, that was the key. Everything here operated on timing, and timing was predictable if you understood the system. That was the emotional hook, because the most powerful advantage is not strength. It is knowing what happens next. Elara turned slightly, her steps measured as she moved away from the balcony and into the corridor. She did not rush. She did not hesitate, because urgency revealed intention, and intention was not something she was ready to show. Not yet. She moved toward a section of the estate that had become increasingly active over the past hours. Not because she had been told to, but because she had noticed the shift in movement, the increase in communication, the tightening of structure. Everything pointed to one conclusion. Something was about to happen, and it would happen soon. Inside the operations room, Adrian had just received confirmation of a planned transfer, one that had been adjusted twice already to avoid interception. It was a necessary move, but also a risk, because every adjustment increased exposure. "We move in 20 minutes, one of his men said. Adrian nodded once, his focus steady. Keep the route internal until the last point. The instruction was clear. Minimize visibility, control access, reduce risk. Everything aligned, everything prepared, everything should have worked. The door opened quietly, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with presence. Elara stepped inside. She did not belong in that room, not according to structure, not according to role, but she entered anyway, and that shifted the space. Adrian's attention moved toward her immediately, not with irritation, but with precision, because her presence there was not accidental. The room fell silent, not because she commanded it, but because her presence disrupted expectation. Elara did not speak immediately. She allowed the moment to settle, because timing mattered. Her gaze moved briefly across the screens, the data, the positioning, and within seconds, she understood, not the details, the pattern. "You need to delay it," she said. The words were calm, not forceful, not uncertain, just clear. The room reacted instantly, not with noise, with tension, because that statement did not belong, not from her, not in that space. Adrian did not respond immediately, because reaction would reveal too much. Instead, he studied her carefully. "You're not part of this operation," he said. A statement, not a correction. Ilara's gaze held his. "I don't need to be." Her tone remained steady, controlled, but beneath it was something else. Certainty. That was the intellectual hook, because confidence without access means knowledge without permission. Adrian's attention sharpened. "Explain," he said. One word. Direct. Ilara stepped slightly closer, her gaze shifting briefly toward the screen displaying the route. "They're not targeting the route," she said. A pause. "They're targeting the adjustment." The statement settled into the room with quiet weight, because it reframed everything, not the movement, the reaction to it. Adrian's mind moved quickly, aligning her words with the pattern he had been analyzing. The timing, the bypass routes, the controlled losses. It fit too well. "They expected you to change it," she continued, "and they positioned for that." Silence followed, not disbelief, recognition, because what she was describing was exactly what Roman Cade had been doing, anticipating, positioning, controlling. Adrian's gaze did not leave her. "How do you know that?" The question was calm, but sharp, because this was not assumption. This was understanding. Ilara did not hesitate, because that's how this kind of war works. Simple, direct, but incomplete. And Adrian knew it, because that answer did not come from observation. It came from experience. That was the emotional hook, because she knew things no outsider should ever know. The room remained still, but the tension had shifted, not toward the operation, toward her. Adrian stepped closer now, reducing the distance between them, not aggressively, but with intent. "You're speaking like someone who's been inside this before," not an accusation, an alignment. Ilara met his gaze without hesitation. "And you're losing ground like someone who doesn't realize it yet." The words landed clean, precise, and impossible to ignore, because they were true. The room held its breath, because no one spoke to Adrian Vale like that. No one. Who didn't understand the consequences? But Ilara did, and she didn't adjust. She didn't soften. She didn't retreat, because she had already calculated something critical. Truth was more valuable than compliance. Adrian's expression remained controlled, but something beneath it shifted, not anger, not frustration, recognition, because this was no longer about whether she was different. It was about how. "Cancel the move," he said. The decision came quickly, not because he trusted her, but because the logic was undeniable. The room moved instantly, the operation halting before execution, and just like that, the outcome changed. That was the intellectual hook, because influence is not about control. It's about changing decisions without owning them. Ilara stepped back slightly, her role in the moment complete. She had not taken control. She had not asked for authority, but she had altered the outcome, and that was enough. Adrian watched her closely as she turned to leave, not stopping her, not questioning her further. Not yet, because now the focus had shifted, not to the war, to her. He returned to the screen briefly, analyzing the cancel route with a new perspective, and for the first time, he saw it clearly: the trap, the positioning, the inevitability of loss. Had they proceeded, they would have been exposed completely, which meant she was right, and that changed everything. He turned back toward the door she had just exited, his thoughts no longer divided, because now he had a new objective, not just to stabilize the war, but to understand her, because someone who could see patterns like that was not an accident. He initiated the search immediately, not publicly, not through standard channels, but through the deeper network, records, archives, data that most systems could not access. Ilara Quinn. The name was entered. The search began. Results appeared. Basic, surface level. Nothing unusual. Nothing significant. which was the first problem, because someone like her should have had a history, a trail, a pattern of existence. But as the search deepened, that pattern disappeared. Record became inconsistent, dates misaligned, information fragmented, and then nothing. No clear origin, no verified connections, no traceable past. The deeper he looked, the less existed. That was the emotional hook, because people do not simply disappear from systems unless someone made sure they did. Adrian leaned back slightly, his expression unchanged, but his understanding shifting into something far more precise. This was not missing information. This was erased information, deliberately, carefully, completely, which meant Ilara Quinn was not just unknown. She was hidden, and people are only hidden for one reason, because what they are matters. His final realization settled with quiet clarity, aligning everything he had seen, everything she had done, everything that had not made sense until now, because this was not a coincidence, not an anomaly, not a mistake. It was design, and as that understanding locked into place, removing the last layer of uncertainty and replacing it with something far more dangerous, one undeniable truth emerged. Her identity doesn't exist in records. The absence of information was never empty. It carried intention. Adrian Vale had seen missing records before, scrubbed accounts, altered identities, histories rewritten to protect or erase. In his world, data was not just stored, it was controlled. And when something disappeared completely, it did not mean it had never existed. It meant someone had made sure it couldn't be found. The search for Ilara Quinn had not produced answers. It had produced silence. And silence, in systems built on surveillance, was never accidental. That was the intellectual hook, because the most dangerous truths are not hidden in what you find, but in what refuses to be found at all. Adrian stood alone in the archive room, a place rarely accessed by anyone but him. Unlike the digital systems that could be manipulated or intercepted, this space held something older, records that had never been fully transferred, agreements documented long before systems became interconnected. Paper did not disappear as easily as data. It required effort, precision, intent. He moved slowly across the shelves, scanning labels that marked years, territories, and alliances that had shaped the structure of power in the city long before his name became dominant. He wasn't looking for her, not directly. He was looking for absence, for gaps, for anything that felt like it had been removed instead of misplaced. Because if Ilara Quinn did not exist in records, then she had once existed under something else. Minutes passed without result. Then something shifted. A section near the back of the archive carried a sequence that felt incomplete. The timeline of entries remained consistent, but one segment had a break, subtle, almost invisible but present. Adrian paused. His hand moved toward the file adjacent to Gap, pulling it free with measured care. The label read, Valari Syndicate. The name was not unfamiliar, but it had not been relevant in years, because the Valari Syndicate no longer existed. That was the emotional hook, because some names don't disappear naturally. They are erased after something goes very wrong. Adrian opened the file, his gaze moving across the contents with increasing focus. The Valari Syndicate had once held a strategic position within the network of organized power. Not dominant, but influential. Their strength had not come from expansion. It had come from control, financial routes, internal access, information. They had been positioned in a way that made them difficult to remove, which meant their disappearance had not been simple. The records detailed a gradual breakdown, not sudden, not chaotic, structured, agreements failing, connections severed, internal instability, then collapse. But something about the documentation did not align, because collapse like that left traces, conflict, resistance, movement. This did not. It ended too cleanly, too precisely, as if it had been planned. Adrian's gaze narrowed slightly as he turned the page, his attention sharpening as a final section came into view. A list of names. Key figures within the Valari Syndicate. Leaders. Operatives. Connections. Most of them marked as deceased. Some unaccounted for. But one stood out, not because it was emphasized, but because it wasn't. A name that had not been marked at all, not confirmed dead, not confirmed alive, just left. And that was the problem, because incomplete records were not mistakes. They were decisions. That was the intellectual hook, because when someone's fate is left undefined, it usually means someone didn't want it confirmed. Adrian's mind aligned with quiet precision, connecting the absence in the records of the absence in Alara Quinn's identity. Valari's syndicate. Erased. Alara Quinn. Untraceable. The connection formed, not as a theory, as a structure. He closed the file slowly, his thoughts no longer searching, because now he had direction. Across the estate, Alara moved through the space with the same controlled presence she had maintained since her arrival. Nothing about her behavior had changed, but something about the environment around her had. It was subtle, almost invisible, but present. More attention, more observation. Not obvious enough to confront, but enough to confirm something. She had been noticed, not for her role, for her influence. That was the emotional hook, because the moment someone starts watching you closely, it means you've already revealed something you weren't supposed to. She did not react to the shift, because reaction would confirm awareness. And awareness was something she controlled carefully. Instead, she adjusted her movement slightly, not to avoid attention, but to manage it, because being watched was not a disadvantage, not if you understood how to use it. Her steps carried her toward one of the quieter sections of the estate, where movement was less frequent and observation less immediate, not absent, never absent, but reduced. She paused near a narrow corridor, her gaze lifting briefly toward a section of the wall that most would ignore, a seam, barely visible, but present, another system, another layer, and she had already noticed it before, because systems like this repeated themselves. She turned away without hesitation, continuing forward as if nothing had registered, because confirming knowledge was never the objective. Controlling perception was. Behind her, movement shifted, not visibly, but functionally, because someone else had noticed something too. Adrian approached from the far end of the corridor, his pace controlled, his focus aligned, not on the structure, on her, because now he was no longer observing behavior. He was testing it. They stopped within the same space, the distance between the measured but intentional. Alara turned slightly, her gaze meeting his without hesitation. No surprise, no reaction, just awareness. That confirmed everything, because nothing about this was unexpected to her. "You've been inside a system like this before," Adrian said. Not a question, a statement. Alara's expression remained unchanged. "Everyone has," she replied. The answer was simple, but not sufficient, and Adrian knew it. "Not like this," he said. His voice remained calm, but sharper now, because this was no longer surface-level observation. This was alignment. Alara held his gaze for a moment longer before speaking again. "Systems are all the same," she said. "They just pretend not to be." The words carried weight, not defensive, not evasive, but deliberate, and beneath them was truth. Adrian studied her carefully, the pieces aligning faster now. The patterns, the knowledge, the absence of fear, the understanding of structure, it all pointed to one conclusion. She was not an outsider. She had been part of something like this before, something close enough to recognize, close enough to navigate, close enough to survive. That was the emotional hook, because she wasn't just a bride, she was a survivor of a war. The realization settled deeper than he expected, because survival like that came with history, and history left marks. "Valari's syndicate," Adrian said. The name entered the space without warning, not loudly, but with precision. Alara's reaction did not come immediately, which was a reaction itself, because delay meant recognition. Her gaze did not shift, her posture did not change, but something beneath it tightened, just slightly. Enough. Adrian saw it clearly, and in that moment, the connection was confirmed. "You were there," he continued. Still not a question. Still not a demand. Just structure. Illyra exhaled slowly, her composure intact, but her awareness now fully aligned with his, because the past had entered the present, and it could not be removed. Not anymore. They don't exist anymore, she said. Her voice was calm, but final. Adrian's gaze held hers. No, he replied. They don't. A pause. But you do. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of meaning, because now there was no distance left between assumption and truth. Illyra turned slightly, not in retreat, but in control, because this conversation had shifted from observation to exposure, and exposure changed everything. Adrian did not stop her, because he understood something now. This was not a truth that could be forced. It had to unfold, layer by layer, moment by moment, because something like this was never simple. His final realization settled with sharp clarity as the structure completed itself in his mind, aligning past records with present reality in a way that could not be undone, because Illyra Quinn was not a constructed identity. It was a replacement, a cover, a decision made after something else had been taken away. And as that understanding deepened, pulling one final thread into place, one undeniable truth emerged, and her real name changes everything. The truth did not create distance between them. It created alignment. Adrian Vale no longer saw Illyra Quinn as an unknown variable. That phase had passed the moment her past intersected with the Valari Syndicate. What remained now was something far more complex. She was no longer a question. She was a factor, and in a war that was already slipping beyond control. Factors determined survival. The estate had not changed physically, but its function had shifted. Decisions were no longer being made in isolation. Movement inside the system had adjusted, not because of visible command, but because the structure itself had begun responding to a new presence within it. Illyra, not as a wife, not as a guest, but as something else entirely, a source of information. That was the intellectual hook, because power does not always come from authority. Sometimes it comes from knowing what others don't. Adrian stood in the operations room once again, but this time the space felt less controlled. Not chaotic, but strained. Every decision carried more weight than before. Every movement required precision. And for the first time, he was not the only one reading the system. Illyra stood across from him, not positioned as an equal, but not dismissed as an outsider either. Her posture remained composed, her expression neutral. But her presence had shifted. She was no longer observing. She was participating. The map displayed across the central table reflected current territorial positions. But more importantly, it revealed patterns of movement. Roman Cade's expansion was no longer subtle. It was structured, predictable, but only if you understood the logic behind it. He's not trying to take everything, Illyra said. Her voice remained calm, but it cut through the room with precision. He's isolating. Adrian's gaze shifted toward her, his focus immediate. Explain. She stepped slightly closer to the table, her eyes moving across the map without hesitation. He's cutting connections, not territories, she continued. He doesn't need control over everything. He only needs control over how things move. The statement reframed the entire situation, because it wasn't about dominance. It was about restriction. That was the emotional hook, because controlling movement is more powerful than controlling space. Adrian studied the map again, but this time through her perspective, the eastern corridor, the northern routes, the bypassed areas, everything aligned. Roman was not expanding randomly. He was shaping the battlefield, forcing movement into predictable paths he already controlled. That realization shifted the entire structure of the war, because it meant every move Adrian had made had already been anticipated. He looked back at her, his expression unchanged, but his attention sharpened. You've seen this before. Not a question, a conclusion. Illyra didn't deny it. Not exactly, she said, but close enough. Her answer was measured, but it carried something deeper, experience. And experience, in a war like this, was more valuable than power. That was the intellectual hook, because knowledge gained through survival cannot be replaced by strategy alone. The room remained silent, but the shift had already happened. Adrian was no longer leading the interpretation. She was, and for the first time, he allowed it. "Then tell me how to break it," he said. The request was direct, but it carried weight, because men like Adrian Vale did not ask for guidance. They took control, but control had already shifted. Illyra's gaze remained on the map, her mind aligning with the patterns she had recognized long before entering this room. "You don't break it," she said. A pause. "You disrupt it." The distinction mattered, because breaking implied force. Disruption implied intelligence. She traced a path across the map, not touching it, but guiding attention. "He expects you to protect what you have left," she continued. "So you stop doing that." Adrian's gaze narrowed slightly. "Leaving it exposed?" Illyra shook her head, making it irrelevant. The room shifted again, because that approach was not defensive. It was strategic. "You move where he's not watching," she said, "not where he expects you to defend." The simplicity of her explanation masked its complexity, because executing it required something most systems lacked. Trust. Trust in unpredictability. Trust in abandoning control. That was the emotional hook, because the hardest move in any war is letting go of what you're trying to protect. Adrian absorbed the information quickly, his mind aligning with the logic behind it. It was risky, unstable, but effective, because it attacked the structure, not the surface. He turned slightly, addressing the others in the room. "Shift focus to secondary routes," he said. "Ignore the primary corridors." The instruction was immediate, clear, decisive, but it came from her. That realization did not go unnoticed, because influence had just changed direction. Illyra stepped back slightly, her role in the moment complete. She had not taken authority. She had not demanded control, but she had redirected the war, and that was enough. Adrian watched her carefully, his understanding deepening with every interaction. She was not just informed. She was precise. Every statement aligned with reality. Every observation led to actionable change. And most importantly, every prediction held, because as the next updates came in, the shift began to show. Roman's movement slowed, not stopped, but adjusted, because the expected response had not happened, and that disruption created space. Space Adrian had not had before. That was the intellectual hook, because unpredictability is the one thing control cannot fully contain. The war had not turned, not yet, but it had shifted, and that shift came from her. Adrian leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed on the data as it updated in real time. For the first time since the war began, he was not reacting. He was influencing, and she was the reason. His attention returned to her once more, not as an observer, but as someone evaluating a critical asset, because that was what she had become. Not a liability, not a variable, an asset, and not just any asset, a strategic one. That was the emotional hook, because the woman he thought was his pawn became his strongest weapon. But weapons came with risk, because they could be turned, used, redirected, and Illyra was not controlled, not fully. That realization settled quietly, but firmly, because while she had helped stabilize the system, she had not committed to it, not entirely. Her motivations remained undefined. Her past remained incomplete. Her presence, intentional. Adrian stepped closer, not a challenge, but to understand. "You're not doing this for me," he said, not accusing, clarifying. Illyra met his gaze without hesitation. "No." The answer was immediate, unfiltered, honest. Adrian's expression did not change. "Then why?" The question remained simple, but its weight was not. Illyra held his gaze for a moment longer before looking away, not in avoidance, but in decision. "Because if he wins," she said, "this doesn't stop with you." Her voice remained calm, but beneath it was something deeper, something unresolved, something personal. And that was the problem, because personal motives created unpredictability. Adrian recognized it instantly, because he had seen it before. People driven by necessity, could be calculated. People driven by something else could not. His final realization settled with quiet precision as everything aligned once again, forming a structure that extended beyond the war itself. Because Illyra Quinn was not just influencing outcomes, she was moving toward something. Something she had not revealed, something tied to her past, something that made her involvement inevitable. And as that understanding took shape, removing any remaining illusion of simplicity, one undeniable truth emerged. But her help came with a hidden motive. The shift did not happen in the war. It happened in the silence after it moved. The strategy Illyra introduced had created disruption exactly as intended. Roman Cade's control had weakened just enough to create space. And for the first time in weeks, Adrian Vale's system was not collapsing under pressure. Movement had stabilized. Internal channels were holding. The structure was no longer reacting blindly. But stability was not resolution, because something beneath it had begun to surface. Something Adrian had not fully accounted for. Illyra, that was the intellectual hook. Because the most dangerous variable is not the enemy you fight. It's the one standing inside your system with a purpose you don't yet understand. Adrian stood alone in the upper section of the estate, overlooking control grounds below. From a distance, everything appeared stable. Guard rotations remained precise. Entry points secured. Communications steady. But he had learned something over time. Surface stability often hid deeper movement. And Illyra was no longer just part of the system. She was influencing its direction, not randomly, not emotionally, deliberately. He had allowed it, because her insight had been accurate, because her strategy had worked, because without her, the war would have already been lost. But now, the question had changed. Not what she could do, but why she was doing it. Adrian turned away from the window, his thoughts aligning with a clarity that had taken time to form. Every action she had taken had been effective. Every decision she had influenced had led to survival. Every step she had made had brought him closer to control. But none of it felt accidental. That was the emotional hook. Because when someone keeps saving you, you have to ask what they're preparing you for. He moved through the corridor with measured steps, not searching for her physically, but aligning the moment he knew was coming. Because he understood something now. Illyra would not hide forever. People like her revealed themselves when the outcome was close, and the outcome was approaching. He found her where he expected, not in isolation, not in concealment, but in a space that allowed observation. The central strategy room, the same place where she had reshaped the direction of the war. She stood near the table, her posture composed, her attention focused, not on data, not on maps, but on something internal, something resolved. Adrian did not announce his presence. He did not need to. She already knew. "You've been waiting for this moment," he said. His voice was calm, but direct. Illyra did not turn immediately, because the statement was accurate. That alone removed the need for reaction. Yes, the answer came without hesitation. And that changed everything. Adrian stepped closer, his gaze fixed on her. Then explain it. Not a request, a demand for clarity. Because now he needed to understand, not her strategy, her intention. Illyra turned slowly, her eyes meeting his with steadiness that had never wavered, but now carried something more, finality, because the time for a partial truce had passed. "I didn't come here to help you," she said. Her voice remained calm, but it carried weight beyond its simplicity. Adrian's expression did not change, but his focus sharpened. "I know," and he did, at least, partially, but knowing she had another motive was not the same as knowing what it was. Illyra held his gaze, her presence grounded, her control absolute. "I came here because this was the only place I needed to be." The words were precise, measured, and intentional, because they shifted the entire structure of meaning. This was not coincidence, not circumstance, not survival. It was positioning. That was the intellectual hook, because the most powerful moves are not reactions. They are destinations planned long before the game begins. Adrian's mind aligned quickly, connecting what he had seen with what she was now confirming. "You chose this." Not a question, a realization. Alara didn't deny it. Yes. And in that moment, the last illusion disappeared. She had not been forced into this world. She had entered it, willingly, strategically, with purpose. Adrian stepped closer, the distance between them narrowing, not physically, but in understanding. Then what is it? He asked. The question carried no anger, no accusation, only clarity, because now the answer mattered more than anything else. Alara's gaze did not shift, because she had already decided to reveal it. I came to finish something. The words settled into the space between them with quiet force, because they carried history, intent, and consequence. Adrian remained still, but internally, everything recalculated. Finish what? The question was inevitable, necessary, and dangerous, because some answers changed everything. Alara exhaled slowly, not from hesitation, but from completion, because this moment was the point everything had been moving toward. A war that never ended, she said. Her voice remained steady, but beneath it was something deeper, something that had not been visible before, something personal. That was the emotional hook, because the most dangerous wars are not the ones still being fought. They are the ones people never stopped fighting. Adrian's gaze sharpened, his understanding shifting again. This war ends when Roman falls. It was a logical conclusion, a direct one, but Alara shook her head slightly. No, one word, simple, but it broke the assumption completely. This war ends when the people who started it are gone. The statement landed with precision, and in that moment, everything changed, because that meant this was not about territory, not about power, not about control. It was about origin, and origin could not be erased. Adrian's mind moved quickly, connecting fragments that had not aligned before. Her knowledge, her past, her connection to a destroyed syndicate, the Valari name. And then it became clear. You're not here because of Roman. Alara's silence confirmed it, and that silence was louder than any answer. Adrian took one final step forward, his voice lower now, but sharper. You're here because of what happened before him. Alara met his gaze fully. Yes. And with that, the truth began to surface completely. Your family, Adrian said, not asking, understanding. Alara did not look away. They weren't just casualties, she said. Her voice remained calm, but now it carried something undeniable. They were targeted. The words shifted the entire narrative, because targeted meant intentional, planned, executed. Adrian's expression remained controlled, but internally, the alignment was complete, because he already knew what came next. By who? The question was quiet, but it carried weight. Alara held his gaze, and for the first time, there was no distance in her answer. You already know. And he did. That was the problem. Because the moment he allowed himself to acknowledge it, everything changed. Adrian's past was not clean. No one in his position had won. Decisions had been made. Wars had been fought. Threats had been eliminated. And sometimes, entire names had disappeared in the process. Not out of emotion, out of necessity. But necessity did not erase consequence. That was the intellectual hook. Because the decisions that secure power are the same ones that create future enemies. Adrian's voice remained steady, but now it carried something new. You think I was involved. Not denial, clarification. Alara did not hesitate. I know you were. The words landed without aggression, without emotion, just truth. And truth was more dangerous than accusation. Adrian did not react immediately, because reaction would suggest weakness, and weakness was not part of the structure, but internally, everything shifted, because this was no longer about war strategy. This was personal. This was past. This was consequence. And Alara was not standing in front of him as an ally. She was standing there as something else entirely, something he had not allowed himself to fully consider, a survivor, with purpose, with patience, with a goal that had not changed. That was the emotional hook, Because she didn't marry him to survive. She married him to finish something. Adrian exhaled slowly, his posture unchanged, but his perception completely altered. And you think this ends with me? It was not a question. It was an understanding. Ilara did not answer immediately, because the truth did not need to be rushed. When she spoke, her voice remained calm, controlled, but final. It ends where it started. The statement carried no hesitation, no uncertainty, no doubt, and in that moment, Adrian understood everything, because where it started was not just a place. It was a decision, a chain of actions, a moment in the past that had created this exact future, and he was part of it, not indirectly, not distantly, directly. That realization settled with sharp clarity, because it removed every remaining illusion, every assumption, every false alignment. Ilara had not entered his world to stand beside him. She had entered it to reach him, and now she had. The silence between them deepened, not empty, but heavy with everything that had just been revealed. No movement, no distraction, no escape from what had become undeniable. Adrian's final realization formed with quiet precision as every piece aligned into one unavoidable conclusion, because the woman standing in front of him was not just his wife, not just his ally, not just his greatest strategic advantage. She was something else, something far more dangerous. And as that truth settled completely, leaving no space for denial, no room for misinterpretation, no illusion of control, one final understanding remained. And Adrian realizes he might be her final target. The silence after her revelation did not break. It solidified. What stood between Adrian Vale and Ilara Quinn was no longer uncertainty, suspicion, or misalignment. It was truth, clear, exposed, and irreversible. The kind of truth that did not ask for reaction, because it already carried consequence within it. He now understood who she was. More importantly, he understood why she was here. That was the intellectual hook, because the most dangerous moment in any conflict is not when the enemy attacks. It's when both sides finally understand each other completely. Adrian did not move immediately, because movement suggested decision, and decision, at this point, would define everything that followed. Ilara remained where she was, her posture steady, her gaze unwavering. She had revealed everything that mattered, not emotionally, not impulsively, strategically, because this moment was not about confession. It was about position. She was no longer hidden, no longer operating beneath perception. She stood fully visible now, as both ally and threat, and Adrian stood in front of the only decision that truly mattered, power or truth, because choosing one would destroy the other. That was the emotional hook, because sometimes winning the war means losing everything you built it for. Outside the state, the conflict had already begun to escalate again. Roman cade system, the weakened, had not collapsed. Pressure was building once more, movements tightening, responses becoming more aggressive. The war was not over. It had simply shifted phase. But inside this room, the real war had already started. Adrian exhaled slowly, his focus sharpening, his thoughts aligning not around emotion, but around consequence. "If I'm the end of your war," he said, his voice calm, "then this was never about Roman." Ilara did not deny it, because denial would weaken the truth. "No," she replied. One word, clear and final. Adrian absorbed it without reaction, because reaction would simplify something that was not simple. "And everything you've done," he continued, "has been to get here." Ilara's gaze remained steady. Yes. No hesitation. No apology, because this had never been accidental. She had entered his world to reach this exact moment, and now they were both standing inside it. That was the intellectual hook, because the most powerful plans are not the ones that win quickly. They are the ones that place you exactly where you need to be at the right moment. Adrian stepped slightly to the side, creating space, not distance, but perspective, because he needed to see the full structure now, not just her role, his. Because if her war ended with him, then his past was no longer separate from the present. It was part of it. He had made decisions years ago decisions that had shaped the system he now controlled, decisions that had removed threats, eliminated risks, secured power, and in doing so, he had created consequences. Illyria Quinn was one of them. That realization settled with sharp clarity, because it meant this was not about blame. It was about outcome, and outcome was unavoidable. Adrian's voice lowered slightly. So what happens now? The question was not rhetorical. It was necessary, because this moment demanded resolution. Illyria did not respond immediately, because resolution was not simple. Not for her. Not anymore. Her goal had been clear, defined, unchanged. Find a man responsible. Reach him. End it. But now, she stood in front of him, and the outcome was no longer as simple as she had planned. That was the emotional hook, because revenge is easy to pursue until you reach the person you've been chasing. Illyria's gaze shifted slightly, not away, but inward, because this was the first moment she had allowed herself to fully process what came next. Not the plan, the consequence. If she followed through, the war would end. Her war. But what would remain? A broken structure, a power vacuum, a system that would collapse without its center. And collapse would not bring justice. It would bring chaos, innocent losses, uncontrolled violence, everything she had already seen before, everything that had destroyed her past. Adrian watched her carefully, because he recognized a shift, not in posture, not in expression, in thought, because for the first time, she was not acting on certainty. She was weighing outcome. That was the intellectual hook, because the difference between revenge and justice is understanding what comes after. You didn't come this far to hesitate, Adrian said. His tone remained calm, not pushing, but acknowledging. Illyria met his gaze again, and for the first time, there was something different in it. Not weakness, not doubt, conflict, because she understood something now that she had not allowed herself to consider before. This was not just about ending him. It was about what that ending would create, and that was not controlled. Adrian stepped closer, but not aggressively, not defensively, just enough to stand inside the same space of consequence. If you do this, he said, you don't just end me. A pause. You end everything tied to the system. The words were not emotional. They were structural, because that was how he saw the world. In systems, in outcomes, in consequences. Illyria's gaze sharpened slightly. I know. And she did. That was a problem. Because now, this was no longer about reaching him. It was about deciding what his removal meant. That was the emotional hook. Because the moment you understand the cost of your revenge, it stops feeling like victory. Outside, the pressure intensified. Movement increased. Security adjusted. The war was approaching another breaking point. But inside, this decision mattered more, because it would determine not just the outcome of their conflict, but the future of everything connected to it. Adrian's final position became clear. He did not reach for a weapon, did not call for protection, did not attempt to control the moment, because he understood something now. Control was no longer his advantage. Truth was, and truth could not be forced. If this is where it ends, he said quietly, then finish it. No resistance, no negotiation, because power without truth meant nothing now. That was the intellectual hook, because true power is not holding control. It's knowing when to let it go. Illyria stood still, completely, because the moment she had spent years preparing for had arrived, and yet it did not feel the way she expected. There was no release, no clarity, no satisfaction, only weight, because now she understood everything. Him, the system, the past, the consequence, and herself. That was the moment everything shifted, not in action, in understanding, because for the first time, she was not standing as a survivor, not as someone seeking revenge, but as someone holding control over what came next. And that changed everything. Her voice came quieter, but stronger than before. This was never just about you. Adrian did not respond, because he already knew it was about what happened. A pause. And what happens after? The words settle between them. And in that moment, the war changed. Not outside, inside. Because this was no longer about opposing sides. It was about opposing truths. That was the emotional hook. Because in the end, the real war wasn't outside. It was between them. Alara stepped back slightly. Not retreat. Not surrender. Decision. Because she had reached a point where choice mattered more than outcome. She looked at him one last time. Not as an enemy. Not as an ally. But as someone connected to the same reality. You don't get to walk away from what you've done, she said, her voice steady. But neither do I. That was the truth. Complete. Unavoidable. Adrian nodded once, because that was the only response that mattered. Understanding. Not victory. Not defeat. Just understanding. And in that moment, something changed between them. Not trust. Not forgiveness. Something else. Alignment. Not in purpose, but in awareness, because they both understood what came next. The war outside would continue. Roman Cade would not stop. The system would not stabilize on its own. And now, they stood in a position where both of them were necessary, not because they trusted each other, but because they understood the stakes. That was the intellectual hook. Because sometimes the strongest alliances are not built on loyalty, but on shared understanding of what cannot be allowed to happen. Alara turned away slightly, her posture steady, her decision made, not to end him, not today, because ending him would not end the war. It would only reshape it. And she was no longer interested in reshaping destruction. She wanted control over what came next. Adrian watched her carefully, because he understood exactly what that decision meant. She had not forgiven him, had not abandoned her purpose. She had changed it, and that was far more dangerous, because now she was not acting from revenge. She was acting from clarity, and clarity creates outcomes that cannot be predicted easily. The silence between them settled again, but this time it was not heavy. It was defined, because both of them had chosen, not each other, but the future of the war, and their place inside it. Adrian's final realization aligned with quiet precision, because everything had changed, not just the war, not just the system, but the dynamic between them. He had married her to win a war, but she had stepped into it to finish something far deeper. And now, neither of them were fighting the same battle they started with. The outcome was no longer just survival. It was control over what remained. And as that understanding settled completely, shaping everything that would come next, every move, every alliance, every decision built on truth instead of assumption, one final truth remained. He married her to win a war, but her truth decided who would survive it.